The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic chant, a cattle call for men who measured their lives in acres and bushels. It was July of '72, and the air in the county fairgrounds was thick with the smell of diesel fumes, dust, and the cheap cigars some of the old-timers still chewed on. Tractors and implements were lined up in neat, sun-scorched rows, their paint faded or gleaming, each one a monument to a farmer's hope or his failure. I was there for a set of cultivator shovels for my John Deere 4020, but mostly I was just watching the dance. Watching men bid on iron with money they didn't have, chasing a dream the bankers were selling them wholesale. And at the center of it all, holding court like a king in his castle, was Richard Vance. Vance wasn't just a farmer, he was a dealer. He ran the International Harvester dealership in town and farmed 1,000 acres on the side, every square inch of it bought on credit. He was standing next to a brand new IH-1066, a monster of a machine with a factory cab, air conditioning, and a turbo that whined like a jet engine. Its red paint was so bright it hurt the eyes. He had a half-dozen farmers gathered around him, their faces a mixture of awe and envy. "Boys, this ain't your daddy's farm all," Vance was saying, slapping the massive rear tire. "This is a money-making machine. You put this in the field, you're not just plowing, you're printing dollars. The bank's handing out money at 5%. You can't afford not to upgrade." I just shook my head and kept my distance. My father, God rest his soul, had lived through the '30s. He'd seen neighbors with fine new tractors lose everything when the dust blew and the banks called their notes. His one lesson, drilled into me until it was part of my bone marrow, was, if you can't pay cash, you can't afford it. So I ran old iron. My 4020 was a '68, paid for. My combine was a John Deere 45, bought used and rebuilt with my own 2 hands. I didn't owe a man a dime, and that was a freedom Richard Vance would never understand. The auctioneer moved past the prime equipment to the back row, the place they called the Iron Graveyard. This was where the broken, the obsolete, and the hopeless ended up. And that's where I saw it. It was an Alice Chalmers HD6 bulldozer, probably from the late '50s. It sat listing to one side, its tracks half sunk into the soft dirt. The blade was scarred and bent, the color a patchwork of faded orange and deep scaly rust. A thick coat of grease and grime covered the engine, and a crudely painted sign on the radiator guard read, "Engine seized." It was 10 tons of dead weight, a monument to neglect. The crowd thinned out. This was junk, pure and simple. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Slim, knew it. "All right, fellas, what am I bid for this fine piece of landscape art?" he chirped, getting a few chuckles. "Lot number 247. She ain't pretty, but she's heavy. Think of the scrap value. Who'll give me $100? $100 to start." Silence. A lone cricket chirped from under the auction trailer. "50. Give me $50. You can't buy a good drunk for $50. I'd been looking at the 40 acres of woods on the back end of my property. It was good land, black soil under a century of leaf litter, but it was choked with oak, hickory, and tangled underbrush. My father had never cleared it, never had the means. I'd gotten quotes to have it cleared professionally, and the numbers they gave me were enough to make a man choke. But if I could get that land into production, it would be 40 more acres of corn and beans, 40 more acres of security, all of it owned free and clear. And to do that, I needed a dozer. $50, I said, my voice quiet but clear. Slim's head snapped in my direction, his eyes wide with surprise. "I got 50 from Jed Stone. Now we're cooking. Who'll give me 75? Heads turned to look at me. I saw the smirks, the shakes of the head. Jed Stone, the man who still ran a 2-row corn picker, buying a 10-ton paperweight. Then I heard Vance's loud, braying laugh. He pushed through the small crowd, a smug grin plastered on his face. $50, Jed? What in God's name are you going to do with that thing? Plant petunias in the engine block, he boomed, gesturing at the dead machine. The men around him snickered. Gonna get it running, I said, not looking at him. Vance laughed again, louder this time. Get it running? Jed, the engine's seized tighter than a banker's fist. The undercarriage is shot. You're buying a boat anchor. He lowered his voice, putting on a show of mock concern. Look, I like you, Jed. You're a hard worker, just misguided. Tell you what, You forget this piece of junk, you come down to my dealership tomorrow. I'll put you in a brand new Case 580 backhoe. Low interest, easy payments. We'll make a modern farmer out of you yet. 75, another voice called out, a scrapper from the next county over. 100, I said immediately. 150, the scrapper countered. 200, I said, my jaw tight. Vance was watching me, his eyes gleaming with amusement. He was enjoying this, seeing me waste my money. He thought he was watching a fool prove himself a fool. The scrapper hesitated. He was calculating the price of steel per ton versus the cost of hauling it away. He shook his head and backed off. Sold, Slim shouted, slamming his hand down. $200 to Jed Stone. Son, you just bought yourself a whole lot of work. The crowd dispersed, chuckling and talking amongst themselves. Vance walked over to me, clapping me on the shoulder with a hand that felt heavy and patronizing. Well, Jed, you're a man of conviction. I'll give you that, he said, shaking his head. When you get tired of using it for a mailbox post, give me a call. My boy can run the cutting torch. We'll haul it off for you. I just nodded and walked over to pay the clerk. I didn't have the energy for a fight. Let him laugh. Let them all laugh. I had looked past the rust and the seized engine. I'd seen the bones of the machine. The main frame was solid. The final drives didn't look cracked. It was a simple mechanical beast built in an era when things were meant to be fixed, not thrown away. It was honest iron, and for $200, it was a risk I was willing to take. Now, before we get into the grease and the busted knuckles of bringing that old iron back to life, I gotta ask you folks, have you ever bought something everyone else called junk, but you knew, deep down, it had good bones? Let me know in the comments what it was. A car, a tool, a piece of equipment. I read every one. Getting the HD6 home was the first challenge. It took a local heavy hauler with a winch and a lowboy trailer half a morning to drag it out of its muddy hollow and chain it down. When he finally dropped it in my yard next to the barn, it looked even worse than it had at the auction. It leaned, it dripped, it sagged. It was the physical embodiment of defeat. My wife, Martha, came out onto the back porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the dozer, then at me. She didn't say a word, but her eyes asked the question for her. It's for the back 40, I told her. It'll save us a fortune in the long run. She just nodded. She'd been with me long enough to know when I'd set my mind to something. She trusted my hands, even when my head seemed to be going in a strange direction. Supper's at 6, was all she said before going back inside. For the next 2 years, that bulldozer became my obsession. It was a ghost that haunted my evenings and weekends. Farming came first, of course. I still had to plant, cultivate and harvest with my trusty 4020 and the old Farmall M I used for lighter chores. But every spare moment, every minute I could steal before sunrise or after sunset was spent on the Alice Chalmers. The first order of business was the engine, a 4-cylinder Buda Alice diesel. Seized. That could mean anything from simple rust in the cylinders to a thrown rod that had welded the piston to the cylinder wall. There was only one way to find out. I started by soaking everything in penetrating oil for a week, letting it seep into every thread and joint. The exhaust manifold bolts were so rusted they looked like lumps of coral. I had to heat each one with an acetylene torch until it glowed cherry red, then hit it with an impact wrench. 3 of them sheared off anyway, which meant drilling them out and retapping the holes later. Pulling the head was a 3-day ordeal. I hooked a chain hoist to a thick oak limb overhanging the dozer and slowly, painstakingly, worked it loose. When it finally broke free with a sickening groan of rusted studs, I saw the problem. Water had gotten in through the exhaust stack, which had no cover. Number 3 and 4 cylinders were full of rusty water. The pistons were fused to the cylinder liners. Vance had been right. It was seized tighter than a banker's fist. Any other man would have called the scrapper right then. But my father had also taught me that patience and pressure could solve most any problem. I cleaned out the cylinders as best I could and filled them with a 50-50 mix of automatic transmission fluid and acetone, a concoction the old-timers swore by for breaking loose rusted parts. Then I waited. While the engine soaked, I turned my attention to the rest of the machine. The fuel tank was full of sludge and water. I had to remove it, steam it clean, and coat the inside with a sealer. The radiator was clogged with ancient wasp nests and dirt. I pulled it and took it to a shop in the city to have it professionally rodded out. The wiring was a mouse-eaten catastrophe, so I tore it all out, planning to rewire the whole thing from scratch. Word got around the county, as it always does. Jed Stone's folly, they called it. Neighbors would slow their pickups as they drove by my place, pointing and shaking their heads. Vance, of course, fanned the flames. At the co-op one morning, getting feed, I overheard him telling a group of farmers, "Poor Jed, the sun's finally cooked his brain. He's out there every night trying to patch up that scrap pile while the rest of us are planning our spring planting. It's a shame to see." They didn't understand. To them, time was money. Every hour spent fixing old junk was an hour not spent in the field or at the bank arranging another loan for a bigger, better machine. To me, that time was an investment. I was trading my sweat for equity. I was building capital with my own two hands, not a banker's pen. After a month of soaking, I put a 6-foot breaker bar on the crankshaft bolt. I pulled. Nothing. I put a pipe over the bar for more leverage and pulled until the muscles in my back screamed and my vision swam with black spots. There was a faint creak. Hope surged through me. I pulled again, and with a sound like the tearing of old canvas, the engine broke free. It moved, maybe only a 1/16 of an inch, but it moved. The next step was pulling the pistons and liners. It was a greasy, brutal job. I built a makeshift press and slowly, painstakingly, forced each liner out of the block. They came out with chunks of rust and grime, but the block itself was sound. I took the block and the crankshaft to a machine shop to have them magnafluxed for cracks and measured. The news was good. No cracks. The crank just needed polishing. Finding parts was a treasure hunt. I drove to salvage yards all over the state, digging through piles of rusting iron. I found a parts catalogue for the HD6 in a dusty corner of an old dealership that had gone out of business. It became my Bible. I sourced a set of oversized pistons and liners from a surplus dealer in Ohio. A gasket set came from a warehouse in Pennsylvania. Each part that arrived in the mail was a small victory, a piece of the puzzle falling into place. Slowly, over the fall and winter, the engine came back together. I honed the new liners, checked the ring gaps, torqued the connecting rods to spec. I rebuilt the injection pump on my kitchen table, the tiny springs and check balls laid out on a clean white cloth. Martha shaking her head with a small smile. By the spring of '74, 2 years after I'd dragged it home, the Dozer had a rebuilt engine, a clean fuel system, and a new wiring harness. The day I decided to try and start it was a cool Saturday in April. I'd filled the radiator, checked the oil, and bled the fuel lines until clear diesel flowed. I climbed into the torn operator's seat, the steel cold through my jeans. I took a deep breath, the smell of fresh paint and old iron filling my lungs. I hit the starter button. The starter motor groaned, turning the big diesel over slowly. 1 revolution, 2. It belched a puff of white smoke from the open exhaust stack. Then it fell silent. My heart sank. I checked the battery connections. They were tight. I bled the fuel lines again just in case. I waited a few minutes and tried again. The starter groaned. The engine turned. A cough. Another. Then a single cylinder fired with a loud bang, sending a perfect black smoke ring into the morning air. Another cylinder caught, then another. The machine began to shake violently, coughing and sputtering like a dying beast. I feathered the throttle, feeding it fuel. The rhythm smoothed out. The individual bangs merged into a low, hammering idle. The Alice Chalmers HD6 was alive. The sound was magnificent. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of Vance's new turbocharged tractors. It was a deep, guttural roar, the sound of pure mechanical power. I let it warm up, watching the oil pressure gauge climb to a healthy number. I eased the master clutch forward, pulled back on the right steering clutch, and the Dozer pivoted on its track. I pushed the throttle forward, and with a surge of power that vibrated through the steel seat and up my spine, the 10-ton machine lurched forward, carving 2 deep trenches in my yard. I had done it. They had all laughed, but I had done it. The timing couldn't have been better. The mid-'70s were a crazy time to be a farmer. Thanks to a massive grain deal with the Soviet Union, commodity prices shot through the roof. Corn that had been $1 a bushel was suddenly fetching $3. Land that had been $500 an acre was now $1,000, then $1,500. A wave of euphoria swept through the heartland. The government was telling us to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row, and the banks were practically begging us to take their money. Richard Vance was in hog heaven. He was the prophet of this new golden age. His dealership was moving iron faster than the factory could build it. He sold dozens of those big new IH tractors, Steigers, Versatiles, four-wheel drives with duals all around, 24-row planters, combines with air-conditioned cabs and stereos. He was a kingmaker, and the currency was debt. He expanded his own operation too. He bought the Miller farm to his east, then the old Peterson place to his south, leveraging every acre to buy the next. He tore out homesteads that had been there for 100 years, bulldozed windbreaks, and filled in waterways to create massive, efficient fields for his massive, efficient machines. He was driving a new Lincoln Continental to the coffee shop every morning, a diamond ring on his pinky finger, preaching the gospel of get big or get out. He'd see me at the co-op and shake his head with a pitying smile. "Jed, you're sitting on a gold mine and you're still digging with a teaspoon," he told me once. "Prices are high, land is available. Now's the time to expand. You could triple your operation in a year." "I'm expanding," I told him. "Oh yeah? How's that?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "The back 40, I said. He threw his head back and laughed, that same loud braying laugh from the auction. "You're still messing with that. Jed, I'm making more money in a morning on grain futures than you'll make off that patch of woods in a decade. You're living in the past." I didn't argue. I just went home and got on the Dozer. Clearing that land was the hardest work I've ever done. The HD6 was a brute, but it was no match for a century of old-growth timber without a fight. There was a technique to it. I'd use a corner of the blade to slice through the roots on 3 sides of a big oak. Then I'd raise the blade high and push, the dozer's full weight rocking as the diesel engine bellowed under the strain, the tracks digging for purchase. The tree would groan, lean, and finally crash to the ground with a sound that shook the earth. Then came the stumps. I had to dig around them, cutting the deep taproots, then get the blade under them and use the hydraulics and the machine's leverage to pry them out of the ground. It was slow, brutal, and dangerous work. The dozer had no cab, just a simple roll bar I'd welded on myself. More than once, a falling limb, a widowmaker, crashed down just feet from where I sat. I worked in a cloud of dust and diesel smoke, my ears ringing, my body aching at the end of each day. While Vance was sitting in his air-conditioned cab, listening to the radio, I was wrestling with roots and rocks. While his wife was redecorating their house, Martha was bringing me a thermos of coffee and a sandwich in the field. While he was signing loan papers for another $100,000, I was spending $50 to have a hydraulic hose repaired. I worked on that 40 acres for 3 seasons. I piled the trees and brush into massive rows, and when the conditions were right, I set them ablaze. The fires burned for days, sending plumes of smoke into the sky that could be seen for miles. After the fires, I used the dozer to level the land, pushing the rich, black topsoil into the holes left by the stumps, smoothing it out for the plow. My neighbors thought I was insane. I was the talk of the township. They were all caught up in the boom. Buying new pickups, taking vacations to Florida. Their net worth was exploding, at least on paper. And I was out back, covered in soot and grease, fighting with a piece of junk to claim a small patch of woods. I was a relic, a failure in the midst of the greatest farming boom in history. But I saw something they didn't. I saw the interest rates at the bank start to creep up. 6%, then 8%, then double digits. I heard whispers at the feed mill about farmers who were struggling to make their payments, even with high grain prices. The cost of fuel was doubling, then tripling. The price of fertilizer was going through the roof. The numbers were starting to get scary. At the coffee shop one morning, old man Hemmings, a farmer who had survived the Great Depression, tried to warn some of the younger guys. "What goes up must come down, boys," he said, stirring his coffee. "The bank is your best friend on the way up, but they're the pallbearer on the way down. An operation built on debt is a house built on sand." Vance, who was holding court in the next booth, just laughed it off. "You gotta spend money to make money, old-timer," he called over. "This is the new age of farming. You can't run a modern business with a 1930s mentality." I just listened, a cold knot tightening in my gut. I knew old man Hemmings was right. I had seen my father's face when he talked about the Depression, the look in his eyes when he described seeing his neighbor's possessions sold on the courthouse steps. That fear was a part of me. It was the fall of 1979 when I finally finished. The last stump was out, the last pile of brush burned, the last patch of ground leveled. I parked the HD6 on the edge of the new field as the sun went down. Before me lay 40 acres of the prettiest, blackest soil you've ever seen. It was virgin land, rich with 100 years of natural fertilizer. It was ready for the plow. And it was mine. Every clod of dirt, every pebble, every ounce of potential in that soil was paid for in full with nothing but $200 and years of my own sweat. I shut down the Dozer's big diesel engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. The setting sun glinted off the worn, polished steel of the blade. In the distance, I could hear a radio from a passing car. A newsman was talking about something called runaway inflation, and about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker, who was promising to break its back, no matter the cost. I didn't know what all of it meant, not really. But as I stood there, looking at the land I had made with my own two hands, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction mixed with a powerful, unsettling premonition. A storm was coming. Vance and the others had built their empires on the shifting sands of credit and government policy. I had built mine on a foundation of solid rock and old, honest iron. And I had a feeling we were all about to find out which one could withstand the wind. The new decade arrived not with a bang, but with a slow, sickening squeeze. The first sign of trouble wasn't in the fields, but in the air. The summer of 1980 was hot and dry. The sky stayed a pale, hazy blue for weeks on end, the sun a merciless white disk. Corn leaves curled up tight by midday, a thirsty prayer for a rain that never came. The creeks dwindled to trickles, then to muddy scars on the landscape. My new 40 acres, with its deep, virgin soil, held the moisture better than most. It gave me a decent crop, not a bin-buster, but enough to pay the bills and put a little aside. Others weren't so lucky. The yields across the county were down by a third. But prices were still high, so most men shrugged it off as just one bad year. They borrowed more for operating expenses, figuring they'd make it up the next season. The second sign was the grain embargo. When the news came over the radio that the president had blocked all grain sales to the Soviet Union, a stunned silence fell over the coffee shop. That single act pulled the floor out from under the market. The price of corn plummeted from over $3 a bushel to just over $2, almost overnight. Suddenly, the math didn't work anymore. Even with a good crop, you couldn't cover the high cost of fuel, fertilizer, and the interest on your loans. That's when you started to see the cracks in Richard Vance's empire. He'd always been the loudest man in any room, his laugh a confident boom that filled the space. But now he was quiet. He'd sit in his usual booth, staring into his coffee cup, his face pale and drawn. The big Lincoln Continental was gone, replaced by a dusty 3/4-ton pickup. He'd lost weight, and his expensive suits were replaced by work clothes that seemed to hang off his shrinking frame. The real trouble started with his machines. He was running a fleet of brand-new International 2+2 tractors, those strange-looking beasts with the cab set between the front and rear axles. They were powerful, but they were complicated. One day I saw one of them getting hauled out of his field on a lowboy trailer. The talk at the parts counter was that the transmission had gone out. A new one installed was a $15,000 job. That was more than I had paid for my entire line of equipment. A few weeks later, his massive Steiger four-wheel drive, the pride of his fleet, sat idle by the side of the road for 3 days. It had thrown a rod right through the side of the engine block. Vance couldn't afford the $20,000 replacement engine, so he tried to find a used one. But there were none to be had. Everyone was in the same boat, trying to patch up their iron instead of buying new. The machine that was supposed to be his greatest asset had become a multi-ton monument to his debt. I kept my head down and kept working. My old 40i20 developed a knock in the engine. I pulled it into the shop, tore it down, and found a bad wrist pin bushing. I ordered the parts for $60, had the rod machined for another $50, and put it all back together myself over a weekend. My total cost was a couple $100 and some sweat. Vance's breakdown had cost him a fortune and put his biggest tractor out of commission for the rest of the season. The real killer, though, was the interest rates. Paul Volcker kept his promise. The Federal Reserve jacked the rates up to choke inflation, and it felt like they were choking us farmers right along with it. My banker, a decent man named Mr. Abernathy, showed me the numbers one day when I was in making a deposit. The prime rate was 18%, then 20%. The operating loans the farmers had been taking out for years at 6 or 7% were suddenly being renewed at 21%. "It's a bloodbath, Jed," he told me, his voice low. "Men who have been responsible their whole lives are going under. They bought land at $2,000 an acre with 5% money. Now the land is worth half that, and the interest on their note is 4 times higher. They can't make the payments, they can't sell the land because nobody's buying. They're trapped." Vance was the most trapped of all. He had leveraged everything. He had borrowed against his existing land to buy more, then borrowed against that new land to buy bigger machinery, all on the assumption that land values and crop prices would go up forever. When the music stopped, he was left holding a mountain of debt that was growing at 21% a year. The end came swiftly. First, the bank foreclosed on his dealership. The bright red International Harvester sign came down, replaced by a stark white banner that just said, "Closed." Then the notices started appearing in the paper. Foreclosure sales, the Miller Farm, the Peterson Place. Finally, the Vance homestead itself, the original 160 acres his grandfather had settled. It was a cold, grey day in November of '82 when they held the auction. It wasn't at the fairgrounds with a fast-talking auctioneer and a hopeful crowd. It was on the front lawn of Vance's house, the one his wife had spent so much money decorating. The crowd was small and silent, mostly neighbors and a few grim-faced bankers in city suits. There was no joy here, only a quiet, painful sense of finality. I stood at the back, my hands in my pockets. I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to bear witness, to see the end of an era. The auctioneer, a local man with a sorrowful face, sold off their lives piece by piece. The household goods went for pennies on the dollar. Then came the machinery. The big Steiger, with its ruined engine, sold for scrap value. The 2+2 tractors, with their liens and high repair costs, brought less than half of what Vance owed on them. Richard Vance stood on the porch next to his wife, looking like a ghost. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. He had been a king, and now he was watching his kingdom be dismantled and hauled away, one piece at a time. He saw me standing in the crowd, and for a moment our eyes met. There was no anger in his gaze, no resentment. Only a profound and terrible understanding. He knew in that moment that I had been right. And he knew that he had lost everything. While the crisis raged around me, my life remained remarkably unchanged. I got up before the sun, did my chores, and went to the fields. My old iron, paid for and maintained by my own hands, kept running. The John Deere 45 combine, which Vance had called a relic, still brought in the harvest. The Farmall M still cultivated the corn, and the HD6 Dozer, my $200 folly, sat ready in the shed, a symbol of my independence. The new 40 acres was my salvation. It produced every year a steady stream of income with no mortgage payment attached. While my neighbors were giving every dollar they made, and then some to the bank, I was able to put my profits in the bank. Martha and I lived simply. We always had. We didn't take fancy vacations or buy new cars. Our wealth wasn't in our checkbook, it was in the rich black soil we owned free and clear. I was weathering the storm, not because I was smarter than anyone else, but because I had heeded my father's warning. I had built my house on rock. The auctioneer finally got to the land. He sold it off in parcels, the bankers hovering close to make sure their minimum bids were met. When he got to the original 80-acre homestead, the piece with the house and the old barn, a hush fell over the crowd. This was the heart of the Vance farm, the piece that had been in his family for 3 generations. The bidding was slow. A few investors from the city made half-hearted offers. No local farmers had the money or the nerve to bid. The price stalled out, well below what the bank needed to cover the note. The banker looked nervous. He was about to bid it in himself, taking possession for the bank, when I heard a voice. My own. $100 an acre, I said, my voice clear and steady in the cold air. Every head turned to look at me. The banker's eyes widened. Mr. Abernathy, who was standing beside him, gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. He knew I was good for it. An investor countered at 110. 120, I said without hesitation. The city man looked at me, then at the old farmhouse with its peeling paint, and shook his head. He was looking for a quick profit, not a piece of history. Sold, the auctioneer cried, his gavel a sharp crack in the silence. To Jed Stone for $120 an acre. I didn't buy it to farm it. I already had enough land to handle. I bought it because it felt wrong to let it go to a stranger, to see a family's century of work turned into a number on a speculator's ledger. I bought it to preserve it. A few days later, I was out on the Vance place, inspecting the old barn, when Richard drove up in a battered Ford Escort. He got out of the car slowly, like an old man. He looked at the house, the barn, the land that had been his whole world. "Heard you bought the home place," he said, his voice raspy. "I did," I replied. He nodded, kicking at a loose stone with the toe of his worn boot. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm not sure yet," I said honestly. "Fix up the barn, I guess. Rent the house out to a young family starting out." He was silent for a long time, just looking at the horizon. "My grandfather built that barn," he said finally, "with an adze and a broadaxe. Cut the timbers himself from the woods out back." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. "You were right, Jed. All those years I laughed at you. Your old junk, your penny-pinching ways. I was building a castle in the sky, and you were digging a foundation. When the wind came, well, he didn't need to finish. Things got out of hand for a lot of folks," I said, not wanting to rub salt in the wound. "No," he said, shaking his head. "It wasn't things. It was me. I got greedy. I listened to the bankers and the experts instead of the old-timers. I thought your father's ideas were ancient history. Turns out they were timeless." He took a deep breath. "I'm working down at the tire shop in town now, mounting tractor tires. Can you believe that? The man who sold $10,000 tractors is now fixing flats for $10 an hour." An idea, one that had been forming in the back of my mind, suddenly became clear. "Richard," I said, "I need a hand around here. This barn needs a new roof, and the house needs work before I can rent it. And my 4020 is due for an engine overhaul this winter. I could use a man who knows his way around a diesel engine. It wouldn't pay much, but you and your wife could live in the house, rent-free, until you get back on your feet." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He looked for pity, for charity in my eyes, but he found none. He just saw a simple, honest offer, a chance to work with his hands again, to feel useful. Tears welled in his eyes, and he quickly turned his head away, embarrassed. I don't know what to say, Jed," he stammered. "Just say you'll start on Monday," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. This time, my hand didn't feel patronizing, it felt like a bridge. And so he did. Richard Vance, the former king of the county, became my hired man. The community was shocked at first, but soon it just became another fact of life. We worked side by side that winter, rebuilding the John Deere's engine in my shop. He was a good mechanic, a natural. Stripped of his pride and his sales pitches, he was just a man who understood machinery. We didn't talk much about the past. We talked about torque specs and bearing clearances. In the shared language of iron and oil, we found a quiet kind of peace. The farm crisis reshaped our world. The men who had mocked me were mostly gone. Their farms were consolidated into larger corporate operations owned by insurance companies in faraway cities. The coffee shop was quieter now. The talk was of survival, not expansion. And slowly my neighbor's perception of me changed. I was no longer Jed Stone's folly. I was the man who had seen the storm coming. Younger farmers, the ones who had managed to hang on, started stopping by my shop. They'd bring over a broken planter part or ask for advice on rebuilding a water pump. They wanted to learn how to be self-sufficient, how to make do and mend. I never charged them a dime. I just passed on what my father had taught me and what the old Dozer had reinforced. Years passed. My son David grew up and decided he wanted to farm with me. I watched him grow from a boy who could barely carry a bale of hay into a young man who could split a tractor and pull a transmission with confidence. One warm summer evening, when David was about 16, we were walking the edge of the back 40, the field I had cleared so many years before. The corn stood tall and green, a testament to the rich soil beneath. We stopped by the lean-to where the old Alice Chalmers HD6 sat in retirement. Its paint was faded, and a fine layer of dust covered its massive frame, but it was still ready. I made sure to start it up a few times a year, just to hear its deep, rumbling voice. David ran his hand over the scarred steel of the blade. "Dad," he asked, "is it true what Mr. Vance says? That you bought this thing for $200 when it was just a pile of rust?" "It's true," I said, a smile touching my lips, "and that everyone in the county laughed at you." "That's true too." He looked from the Dozer to the 40 acres of prime farmland stretching out before us, then back to me. He was starting to understand. He was connecting the machine, the land, and the life we lived. "Grandpa always said, if you can't pay cash, you can't afford it," I told him, putting my arm around his shoulders. "That sounds simple, but it's hard to live by when everyone around you is getting rich on borrowed money. They look at a machine like this and see a pile of junk. They see wasted time. I looked at it and saw freedom. Freedom from the bank. Freedom from fear." I pointed out across the fields, golden in the setting sun. "Everything you see, son, from that fence row to the creek, is ours. Not ours and the bank's. Ours. It was paid for not with a signature on a loan document, but with grease under our fingernails and calluses on our hands. Never forget that. Land and iron are honest. They don't lie. You take care of them, and in the hard times, they'll take care of you." He nodded, a look of quiet understanding on his face. He was getting it. The lesson was taking root. I looked at the old Dozer, a 10-ton monument to patience and hard work. In its silence, I could still hear the roar of the engine, feel the shudder of the tracks, and remember the smell of diesel and hot steel. It was more than just a machine. It was the physical proof of a philosophy, a tool that had not only cleared a forest, but had secured a future. It had buried a false dream of easy credit, and in its place had saved the acres for the next generation. And in the quiet heart of the American farmland, that was a legacy worth more than all the money in the world.